Two savers open their laptops on the exact same July morning in 2026, staring at the same $10,000. Same income this year, same emergency fund already covered, same decisions sitting in front of both of them right now. The first saver picks a high-yield savings account, one whose rate can move with the market whenever it wants. The second saver picks a one-year CD, locking today's rate in place so it never budges again either way. Almost every savings video released this year insisted on locking in a CD before the Fed starts cutting rates. Nobody built that advice for a year where the Fed might raise rates again, instead of cutting them at all. Markets are now pricing real odds of a Fed hike, the exact opposite setup every lock-in now video assumed. So which one of these two accounts actually wins once the old playbook gets flipped completely upside down? By the end, the real Fed hike math will show exactly which of these two accounts actually wins. To answer that, rewind first to the very start of 2026 before any of this year's Fed meetings happened. Inflation looked like it was cooling, a new Fed chair had just taken over, and lower rates felt locked in. Then inflation reversed direction hard, climbing back up toward levels nobody had actually priced in for this year. The Federal Reserve has now held its benchmark rate steady at every single meeting since the start of the year. That target range's lower bound currently sits at exactly 3.5%, according to the Fed. Its upper bound sits at 3.75%, capping that same target range for now. Both of our savers are working from that exact same starting point, on the exact same July afternoon. Both are deciding where their $10,000 sits for roughly the next 12 full months ahead of them. Neither saver actually knows yet which direction the Fed is genuinely about to move next this year. One is betting the Fed holds steady or hikes, the other is betting almost nothing changes at all. That single disagreement about where the Fed is headed is about to decide who actually wins this comparison. Here's the version most comparison videos stop at, the one built entirely for a falling rate world. The best CDs on the market right now are paying close to 4.4%, completely fixed. Lock that rate in today and it genuinely does not care what happens at the next Fed meeting. The best high-yield savings accounts are paying a little less right now, closer to 4.2%. But that rate is variable, so the bank can lower it whenever it decides to do so. Under the old falling rate logic, locking in that CD rate always wins this particular matchup outright. On paper, over one full year, that CD's small rate edge alone earns roughly $18 extra. That's essentially the entire argument every single lock in a CD video has been running all year long. It sounds airtight on the surface until the Fed's own recent meetings quietly undercut that entire assumption instead. Every one of those videos quietly assumes the direction of rates from here, instead of actually questioning it. And that unquestioned assumption is exactly what this year's string of Fed meetings has started to break apart. That assumption breaks because markets are no longer betting on a cut this year. They're pricing in a hike. Bank of America's forecast now calls for 3 separate rate hikes landing before the end of this December. If the Fed actually delivers those 3 hikes, that locked CD rate stops looking quite so safe. That forecast comes from just one bank's read on inflation, energy prices, and a still resilient labor market. A locked rate protects you beautifully when rates are falling, but it quietly traps you when they're rising instead. Every extra basis point the Fed adds from here on becomes money the CD holder simply cannot touch. The saver's variable rate account, by contrast, is built specifically to catch every one of those increases automatically. That's the entire premise flipped on its head. The safe choice becomes the one exposed to missing out. There's also a quieter cost sitting underneath both of these accounts that almost nobody ever mentions on camera. Every dollar of interest either account earns gets taxed as ordinary income, never at some lower special rate. So the real comparison isn't the advertised rate at all. It's what actually lands in your account after tax. Taxes hit both sides of this particular comparison evenly, so they don't actually decide this contest either. What decides it instead is something most people never picture clearly until the actual Fed meeting happens. Even the FDIC insurance backing both accounts is identical up to $250,000 per depositor. Safety and taxes turn out identical on both sides, leaving only the Fed's next move to actually decide this. And that single decision is exactly what the rest of this year is now quietly riding on. Picture the calendar now, tracking both accounts forward month by month from that same starting point in July. Through August, both accounts behave almost identically, since no Fed meeting has actually happened yet this cycle. September brings the first Fed decision under this hawkish forecast, and the first quarter-point hike lands. The saver's variable rate account adjusts upward within days, following the bank's normal posted rate pricing practice. The locker's CD does not move at all because a locked rate cannot respond to anything that happens. October arrives, and the forecast's second hike lands right on schedule at the very next scheduled meeting. The saver's account climbs again, now sitting noticeably above where the frozen CD rate has been sitting. December closes out the year with a third hike, the final one this particular forecast currently expects. By year-end, the saver's variable rate has climbed by roughly 0.75% total. Averaged across the full 12 months, that puts the saver's effective yield closer to 4.7%. Run that average yield against the balance both savers started with, and the savers account earns about $470 this year. The locker's CD, frozen since July at its original rate, earns about $440 over that same year instead. That's roughly a $30 edge to the saver in a scenario built specifically to hurt the CD. Scale that SAT math up to a much larger $50,000 balance sitting in the same two accounts. At that larger size, the gap between the two accounts grows to about $150 for the year. $30 alone will not change anyone's life, but the direction of that number is the entire point here. Every additional rate hike this year nudges the contest a little further away from the CD's favor. And that gap keeps widening the longer the Fed keeps raising instead of cutting rates back down. If a fourth hike follows into next year, that same gap widens again in the saver's direction. But forecasts change quickly, and this whole calculation flips the moment the Fed actually reverses course instead. A single surprise cut next spring would erase the saver's entire edge within a matter of weeks. So what happens to both of these savers the day that hike forecast turns out to be wrong? Here's the catch no spreadsheet can ever fully price in, because it depends entirely on human behavior. That $30 edge only shows up if the saver actually keeps hunting for the best available rate. Banks routinely let their posted high yield rates drift lower, while quietly hoping nobody notices or moves their cash. Do you actually check your account's rate every single month? Or does it just sit there quietly losing ground? The locker, meanwhile, never has to think about any of this once the CD is actually opened. One decision, one signature, and the rate stays locked no matter what the saver does for the rest of the year. That kind of peace of mind has real value, even when it never shows up inside a spreadsheet. There's a second catch hiding in what happens if either saver suddenly needs that cash early instead. The saver can withdraw at any time, penalty-free, exactly the flexibility a locked account simply cannot offer. The locker who breaks a CD early forfeits a real chunk of the interest they've already earned so far. On a one-year CD specifically, that penalty commonly runs close to about 3 months of earned interest. That's real money lost if life throws a genuine emergency at you before the CD ever fully matures. Would you honestly bet on needing zero access to that money for a full uninterrupted 12 months? So the real question here is really how each saver actually behaves once the account gets opened. A disciplined rate shopper genuinely wins with the high-yield account, while a distracted one quietly gives that edge back. And a locker who never needs the cash early still gets a certainty that money simply cannot buy. Neither account rewards you for picking correctly, they both reward you for behaving consistently afterwards, so which one actually wins? Let's go back to that flawed debate we called out right at the very start of this video. Every lock in a CD video assumed rates only ever move one direction, and this year proved that wrong. But that doesn't mean the CD side of this argument deserves to get thrown out entirely either. If the Fed's forecast hikes never actually happen, that locked CD rate still wins this contest outright. The Fed has now held rates steady across 5 straight meetings without moving in either direction at all. Holding rates steady remains the single most likely outcome at any one given Fed meeting this year. Even so, 3 of the 12 voting Fed officials pushed to raise rates at the very last meeting instead. After tax, that $30 edge narrows even further, shrinking down into little more than pocket change for most savers. For anyone who values certainty over chasing an extra $30, the CD still remains a genuinely fair choice. It removes the decision entirely from the locker's hands, and removing decisions is its own kind of financial discipline. The high-yield account only wins its case if hikes actually land and you actually keep tracking them closely. That's 2 separate conditions stacked directly on top of each other, and both have to land for it to actually win. So here's roughly where this actually lands once the false certainty gets stripped away from either side completely. If you might need this cash inside the next 12 months, the flexible account is clearly the safer bet. If you're confident that money stays fully untouched regardless of what happens, the fixed rate still holds up fine. If you genuinely believe the Fed is about to hike multiple times, the variable account captures that entire upside. If you think a hold is more likely than a hike, the locked rate protects you either way instead. Remember those 2 savers from the very start staring at the same $10,000 back in July? Neither one actually made a mistake, they simply made a bet on a different version of the Fed. The irony is that the safe lock choice is now quietly betting against the Fed hiking at all. And the flexible choice everyone dismissed all year just became the one genuinely built for this exact moment. So which side of that quiet irony is actually about to cost someone real money by the end of this year? So, which bet are you actually making with your own cash sitting in the bank right now? Drop your rate and your reasoning in the comments, and we will compare notes on where the Fed goes next. There's another everyday banking decision quietly shaped by whatever the Fed does next, and we will get to it eventually. This video is for financial education only, not personalized financial, investment, tax, or legal advice of any kind. Run your own numbers against your own timeline, or talk to a licensed professional before making any real move.